put on. And welcome everyone. We're going to get started tonight, as usual, with just a few prayers. Again, we will recite the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha just one time rather than three. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. We'll do the short mandala offering. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, Refuge and Bodhicitta, which we'll do as usual the first time in English, and then twice more chanting the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye dupar sho sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sanamgi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupal Sho. Hey, whoops, my camera got fuzzy here. Take it off and put it back on. Hopefully that's a little better. Let's do a little meditation before we begin. Again, we'll just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath, and you can use whatever technique you prefer to do that. Try to keep the awareness with the breath. When the mind wanders, just guide the mind gently back to the breath. We'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight's teaching. So now let's set our motivation and recall that in our last session 2 weeks ago, we were investigating the teachings of the person of middling capacity. Let's start there for setting our motivation tonight. We examined these 6 types of suffering or difficulty that we have in samsara. And the whole purpose of beginning to see the suffering nature of cyclic existence is so that we can wish for our own freedom first, to really see that what we are involved in is unsatisfactory. When we have difficult times, suffering in our lives, the grief of loss, having to face illness, even contending with aging and other difficulties of having this human existence. All of this is evidence. It points to the unsatisfactory nature of our conditioned existence. As long as we are under the control of our karma, our delusions, this is what we have to face. And we've been involved in this since beginningless time. And now, in this life, having met with the Dharma in this most fortunate human rebirth, we can create the causes for our own liberation. The Buddha taught a path that will lead to our final freedom from all suffering. And we can start with setting that motivation because we do have to have that self-compassion, that genuine wish for our own well-being. Then we have to extend that because we're not alone in our predicament at all. Every sentient being is in the exact same situation fundamentally as ourselves, and under the control of their karma, their actions, having to deal with the afflictions, these deluded states of mind that are guiding them constantly, and therefore having to experience the varieties of suffering, dissatisfaction in psychic existence. And when we see how connected we are to these beings, how much we depend upon them for everything that brings us happiness, all our well-being comes about through the kindness of others. Well, how can we possibly separate our own welfare from theirs? How can we think about freeing ourselves from samsara and leaving behind all these kind sentient beings? So therefore, we embrace their welfare completely, in addition to our own, thinking that we are dedicated to helping all beings, ourselves included, to find true peace and happiness and to be free from all suffering, all dissatisfaction. And in order to accomplish this, we hold that thought of, I must become a Buddha. I must become enlightened. For without that ability that I will gain by becoming a Buddha, I won't be able to serve sentient beings perfectly. I won't be able to guide them skillfully. So I am going to use this time this evening studying the Dharma in order to accomplish complete enlightenment for myself, so I then can lead all sentient beings to attaining that same state of enlightenment. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully, and we'll start our class. So as I said in the last class that we had 2 weeks ago, we did get into the teachings of this level of middling capacity. Let me go ahead and put on screen the slides that I had prepared for tonight. Some of these starting with a kind of a repetition of slides that are just getting us into the text once more. We're in that of the actual practice. We went through the basics relating to a spiritual friend, as well as acknowledging the preciousness of this human life, and then went into the path of the inferior person. I won't go through all the teachings there, but that was primarily around getting a good rebirth, assuring that we have a continuity of good rebirth so that we can continue not just to not suffer in the lower states, but moreover, to have the opportunity to continue our spiritual development. Then we entered into the path of the intermediate person, which consisted of, uh, as we began last time, the sufferings of the happier realms and the general sufferings of samsara. So we went through those verses that pertain to the happier destinies, which are the rebirth as a human, a god, or a demigod, and seeing that even within those existences that are more ideal, we do still have suffering. We do still have lots of discontentment that we can experience, especially in the human realm. Then we are in the section on the general sufferings of samsara. And last time we went through these 6 faults or 6 forms of suffering that we can identify. The fault of uncertainty, of dissatisfaction, and so on. I won't go through those again. Tonight we're going to go on to look at the general sufferings of samsara in terms of what are called the 3 sufferings. So these are verses 293 to 296. That's where we left off last time. Whoops, maybe I went back too far. Sorry, meant to go here. Okay, so these are the 3. I'll reorganize those slides so that they're in the right order. How to think about the 3 sufferings. We're going to go through the verses pertaining to this, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce these to you, though I'm sure every one of you has heard these, but it always helps just to refresh our memory. The very first one is sort of the tip of the iceberg, the suffering of pain, or sometimes called manifest suffering. This is the dukkha that is in your face. That is something that we all can acknowledge we want to be free from and that we don't want to experience because it's the painful experiences of our body physically, as well as our mind, all of our mental anguish, and so on. The suffering of change is referring to the pleasant experiences that we have that are unsatisfactory by virtue of the fact that they change, that they do not continue to provide the happiness that we experience from them, and they don't provide any real lasting happiness. So we'll look at that in terms of the verses. There's not really too much about each of these, but I'll talk about them a little bit more after we go through the verses. And then the final one, which is said to be the most difficult to realize of the 3, pervasive conditioned, or I put in there in parentheses, compounding suffering. I think that's how Rinpoche would tend to refer to it. That's referring, of course, it's pervasive, meaning that it's throughout all of our existences and every moment of our existence. This is the very state of being under the control of our karma and delusions that we are dealing with, that we are going from life to life, as they say, appropriating new aggregates, kind of getting a new body and having a new mind to some degree, that because it's influenced by the particular state of existence that we're born into. Getting an animal mind, for example, that is not able to cognize, certain things because of the limitations of ignorance in the mind of that being. So we appropriate a new mind and body again and again through the force of our karma and delusions. This is the state that we're all in. Essentially, this is like being in a prison, and we aren't seeing it as a prison. We're actually enticed by many of the things of samsara and continue to be preoccupied with them. But we have to see that the whole thing is faulty. It's kind of flawed from the very beginning. So let's go ahead and look at the verses that pertain to this in Essential Nectar. This begins with, again, verse 293. That's at the bottom of, in the copy that you have, it's page 222 of the book, The Essential Nectar, with commentary by Geshe Rabten. It says here in 293, not only our body, let me actually make this a little bigger. I forgot to enlarge it. Whoops, somehow got blue as well. Okay, let me go scroll down now. So, not only are body and mind afflicted with suffering of misery, the first of the 3, suffering of pain, in these ways, because most of what we talked about previous to this was really the suffering of pain, having to meet with unpleasant things and so on, having to take rebirth again and again, what have you. But every contaminated feeling that seems like pleasure in samsaric states isn't pleasure by nature, but only appearance of pleasure in a cessation of pain. This is the second one, the suffering of change. And I might talk about it a little bit because, again, the first one's easy to see, right? That's the stuff that we naturally are, wanting to avoid in our lives, is the suffering of pain, having headaches, having problems with our bodies, having to, deal with loss in our lives, what have you. This is not a pleasant thing, and yet it is indicative of our situation. It's not the full extent of what we mean by dukkha or suffering, but it does give us a flavor of the unsatisfactory nature of it. But right now, most of us are probably not experiencing that to any great degree. Maybe some to some degree we are. The second level is pointing out that the fact that even when we engage in pleasurable things, we still have to suffer, essentially, because that experience of pleasure isn't lasting, isn't something that actually can be sustained. And it doesn't actually lead to sort of a satisfaction at a level that is much deeper, because we continually go back to these things. This is why we have sense objects, all around us that we are continually looking to bring us some pleasure. And we go to them and they give us their requisite amount of pleasure. And then we go on to the next thing. We're like, you know, birds that are going from flower to flower to get all the different nectars. And we convince ourselves that we're happy because of that. But none of these individual experiences completely satisfies us. Instead, they actually will lead to pain if we kind of continue to partake of them. The wonderful analogy, that quick one that I'll share with you from Lama Tsongkhapa's text, I believe, Lamrim Chenmo, but also my teacher in Italy would talk about it frequently, because when we were studying in Italy, we were only about, I don't know, 10 miles away from the Mediterranean Sea. And when things warmed up and got kind of hot up at the center, in terms of wasn't so pleasant, we would go down to the seaside and go into the sea. Well, when you go down there, you're kind of hot, and so you get into the cool water and you start feeling very refreshed and cool. But then maybe, it's not quite, perfect day, so there's a bit of a wind or something, and you start getting cold. So you need to get out of the water and lay in the sun so that you can get warm again. Then it gets too hot in the sun and you go into the water and you cool down, but then it gets too cool and you go back on the beach and lay in the sun. We call this having fun at the beach, but it's not true pleasure, because it's only a contrast, as was said in our verse. It's only this cessation of pain that we experience as pleasure. There's the pain of being hot first that is ceasing when we enter into the water. But then we are beginning the pain of being cold, because the conditions are there for us to eventually get cold in the water, and we want that pain to be ceased. So we go back out in the sun. And then we start the pain of being in the sun and getting too hot. So there's no real satisfaction there. It's just an illusion that we're experiencing, an appearance of pleasure. And this is true with regard to everything we experience in our conditioned world. Again, Dharma happiness is different. Dharma happiness does lead to greater and greater satisfaction, because that's generated internally and it's not contingent upon these external conditions. But everything that we go to that is bringing us some measure of what we call pleasure isn't true pleasure, isn't true happiness. So we have to see that for what it is. Can recognize that it doesn't have the ability to really satisfy at the deepest level. And if we sustain it, it actually will become painful. If you just lay in the sun and never get in the water, well, you're going to burn. It's going to get too hot. So this is the nature of these experiences. The last one, again, this pervasive condition suffering, this is in the next verse, and there's even a deeper explanation of it in the verses that follow. So let's go to verse 2. Actually, it's the final part of this verse, the final line. So let's go through that and 294, because actually, no, let's go through 294 and 295. I'm sorry. So, in particular, our author says, we are always gripped by the suffering of being conditioned, it's taught. So, this is the bigger picture of our suffering, that we are in this state of dissatisfaction all the time. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, there are no vacations in samsara. We actually never get away from this experience of being conditioned, not even for 1 second. In short, just as one has no chance to be happy while one must carry a heavy burden, So there's no chance to be happy as long as I have to hold these skandhas, aggregates. It's the Sanskrit for aggregate I've taken. Again, the mental and physical components of our the basis for our being. We continually have a new set of those every lifetime. These skandhas are externally governed by my previous deeds and defilements. They're a product of our own karma. And they have at all times the seeds of the birth of all future suffering and defilements, right? Because we carry that karma with us. And in every existence, we are creating new karma. So we are just, perpetuating our stay in prison while we are in prison. There's no getting out of prison unless we see it for what it is and begin the process of actually removing ourselves from prison. Therefore, they bring all the reincarnations and sufferings of future lives and are the basis of all the sufferings of this life, like birth, aging, sickness, and death. They bring forth the sufferings of misery and change in the manner of froth from water. Under deeds and defilements right from their formation, their nature is suffering and absence of pleasure. So this is just pointing to this, again, something we have to contemplate very deeply. If we don't get this third level of dukkha or suffering, we cannot really develop the mind of renunciation. We can renounce, of course, the suffering of pain very easily. Even animals renounce it to some degree, not wanting to experience the pain or difficulty of whatever they're encountering. But even the second level of suffering of change, that takes some energy to renounce because we do have to see that the pleasures of samsara are not really in that nature. But to get this kind of overarching suffering that is going on all the time, that is our being conditioned to go from life to life, to circle from existence to existence, under the control of our karma and delusions. This is the heart of developing renunciation. We have to see it all as completely unsatisfactory. I think I may have mentioned the term renunciation, though I don't recall. In Tibetan, it's nyenjong, and nyenjong literally means to definitely emerge, meaning like we have this certainty, this definiteness that we are going to emerge from this nonsense that we've been involved with since beginningless time. And it takes a lot to kind of get to that place. But once we see it for what it is, it's, again, a really powerful thought because it keeps us from being ever engaged in really what we have come to see as faulty because it doesn't lead to anything. Again, we can still use the sort of raw experience of samsara on our path without a doubt. But nonetheless, we don't look to it anymore as being where we want to be. It's thank you, been there, done that. I'm off to something else. And again, this is the level we're working with, is that personal um, liberation, that wish for us to be free from our experience. And then we can translate that into terms of seeing it in others, just like we did in the motivation tonight. So these three levels of dukkha are the general way that I teach on, the suffering, true sufferings, the first of the Four Noble Truths. But I'm just doing kind of an overview. There are lots of particulars, obviously, in terms of the six that we looked at, and then even within the human realm, there's the seven that we examined. And the eighth was this kind of third level here, the being under the control of our karma and delusions to appropriate aggregates again and again. So these are ways of waking us up to what we're really involved in and seeing it for what it is. Get to the final verse of this section on the three sufferings, and this is really more even like a summary of everything that we've looked at in this section about the nature of samsara. Hence, if I win not the supreme peace, exhaustion of all the skandha's suffering, wherever I'm born in the three realms, six classes, is as if I lived in a pit of thorns, again, a prison. It's nothing pleasant. It's nothing we should be that enamored of. From the very nature of the three sufferings, I have no chance of happiness. So now is when I shall liberate myself from this prison of samsara. So we need to get to that place where we say, okay, I'm fed up with samsara. And it's not it was interesting in Italy, the translator that we had, his name was Tupten Sherab. He was a monk when he was younger, but he's not Geshe Tupten Sherab by any means. This was uh, he was from the Sherpa area of Nepal, and his Sherpa That was his first language, obviously, and of course he learned English, but his English was very choppy at times. And when he would translate things around renunciation, he'd say, "Getting depressed with samsara." I mean, we're not really talking about getting depressed in a sense, because there's a way out. You have to recall that in terms of the Four Noble Truths, first we learn true sufferings because we have to know them. Then we learn the true origins of suffering, which we're going to talk about in a moment, which are the things we have to abandon, then, that we have to actually get rid of in order to experience any freedom from suffering. The third and the fourth truths, the cessation of suffering and the path that leads to that, are the Buddha's amazing gift to us, that not just telling us what we're involved in and how it is, but how it actually could be. So getting depressed isn't really the idea. When we are engaged in samsara still, because we're going to continue to be in this embodied existence until we attain that freedom, we shouldn't be depressed about it. We should actually just once more see it for what it is. All these amazing pleasures we can experience are not really going to lead to true happiness. As long as we're continuing to go from life to life, there's no guarantee of even temporal happiness, much less ultimate happiness, which is unattainable until we actually turn away from all of it. So we have to begin to see things more accurately and not get depressed about them. But a word I like to use is disenchanted. It's like it's no longer enchanting. Whatever samsara has to offer to us, it's like, as I said, been there, done that. I don't need to do it again. Yeah, there's a wonderful text that I taught for the folks up in Taos the last several months called Letter to a Friend by Nagarjuna. And in there, he goes into all the various ways that we are, again, can see this unsatisfactoriness. We can, kind of be reminded of it in terms of the variety of things that we have in our lives and how all these pleasures have never really brought us any lasting satisfaction. If you were to heap them all the things that we've ever had that brought us pleasure, it would be immense. But are we any happier due to all of that? We still crave new things. We still crave having to, kind of refresh the experiences of good things that we've had in the past. We're never really satisfied in samsara. So again, this is the purpose of this whole section. Now we are going to go on to the next section, which is still part of the middle scope. Again, going to share some quotes from Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archives book that I think all of you have been reading and familiar with and using in your meditation, no doubt, Lam Rim Year. Here's from Lama Zopa, these two slides. We have suffered numberless times from beginningless rebirths, and all the activities in this life are nothing new, kind of what I was just saying, right? We've done everything numberless times without thinking about the endless suffering of samsara, or the numberless times we will experience the oceans of suffering of each realm in the future, or the suffering of samsara that is without end. So even without looking at all this future suffering, just thinking about our experience numberless times in the past is enough, or should be enough. Just this is enough to practice Dharma. If we think about this, everything that is non-Dharma stops and we practice Dharma. Of course, it doesn't mean you should neglect thinking about the future experiences of being in samsara, but just even getting our heads around all the countless things, again, that we've experienced, piles and piles of pleasurable things that have not brought us any real satisfaction. They've only made us thirstier and thirstier for other temporary experiences that don't really lead us to true peace. So we are going on then to the second part of this, how to think about the process of functioning of samsara and practice the path to liberation. So we first have some verses that give us an idea of how samsara functions. Why are we in this? It's essentially the second noble truth, again, the true origins or causes of dukkha, of being in this unsatisfactory state. And then we'll go on to look at the path to liberation. So let's go ahead and look at the text, the two verses that pertain to this next topic. Again, how to think about the process of functioning of samsara, and then go on to practice the path to liberation. So we don't have the subtitles in here or the sub outlines of first the functioning of samsara, but essentially it's these first two verses of this section. What, one may wonder, is the cause of thus continually circling, without my control, like a whirling firebrand among the six classes of beings? They say like if you take a firebrand in the dark and you just keep spinning it in a circle, you can't really tell, where the beginning or end of any of it is because it becomes just this circle that is unbroken that we just keep going. Again, among the 6 classes of beings afflicted by the 3 sufferings without break. So we may wonder, well, what is the cause of all of this? Verse 298, since beginningless time, the great demon of self-grasping. This is, of course, the root ignorance that is grasping especially at ourselves as inherently existent. This is the root of samsara. This self-grasping thinking, I, has dwelt in my heart's recesses, marking self off from others. It generates greed and hatred. With these, karmas heaped up. Through karma, I spin in samsara, and of course have all the variety of experiences in samsara. So what's being detailed here is this causal process that we need to understand in order to unravel all of this. The first noble truth was all about waking us up to what we are actually engaged in. So we see it as something that is not desirable. We really get that at a very deep level. But then we have to go on to acknowledge, well, but where does that come from? It's not, again, coming from nowhere. There are causes for it. This is, again, one of the most basic teachings that the Buddha taught again and again is dependent arising. Things arise, particularly here in this context, from their respective causes and conditions. So where does our suffering, our dukkha, come from? It comes from its respective causes and conditions, which are, as I pointed out a few times already tonight, karma and delusions. And of course, among delusions, the deepest one, the root delusion of ignorance. So some of you may have seen my tree of samsara before. This is something I put together as an example of how we could formulate the process by which we are experiencing things in samsara. It's all on the tree. Everything that we experience, essentially, in our conditioned existence is there. Let's go to the bottom of the tree, which is the roots. And we see that number one there, the root is the ignorance that clings to the I, especially, but also all phenomena to be truly or inherently existent. So there's no difference in the way that things are grasped, but we do say that the main reason why we ourselves are cycling in samsara is because we grasp at this I, this self, to be real. And it isn't real in the way that we think it is. It does have some reality, but the reality is actually very, very slight. We're going to talk about that more when we get into the perfection of wisdom and the bodhisattva's perfections in the third level of the stages of the path. Okay, so from those roots of ignorance, the trunk are kind of the different mind states that arise. They can be wholesome, they can be unwholesome. We also could say they can be neutral, but those are the two main ones that cause us to have various experiences. The wholesome thoughts, such as, kindness, generosity, what have you, and the unwholesome ones, such as anger, greed, jealousy, all of those. They're all arising within ignorance, though, even our positive ones of compassion, kindness, love, you know, what have you. All of those are still arising within ignorance as well. Okay, so they arise up out of that ignorance, and then the branches in this example, this analogy, are the karma, the actions, which are virtuous when they're driven by wholesome thoughts and non-virtuous when they're driven by unwholesome thoughts. And of course, they can be, mere thoughts, but they are often actions of body, actions of speech, and those create a seed by which we experience their results. The results are the fruits, number 4. The fruits are the suffering and happiness we experience from our karma. I should probably reverse the order. I keep presenting this and forgetting to do so until I present it again. But essentially, to keep it in line, our happiness comes from virtuous actions, number 3, which comes from 2, wholesome thoughts. And of course, they're still rooted in ignorance, so they're going to provide us with experiences of pleasure and happiness. But again, those are still part of the tree of samsara and are still unsatisfactory. Why? Because they're all rooted in ignorance. They're not bringing about any freedom from the whole situation. Now, the fruits of suffering or pain, and I'm using that specifically to refer to pain or uh, mental, physical anguish, what have you. Those are arising from our non-virtuous actions, the third, and then the second, the unwholesome thoughts that give rise to that. And those, of course, are rooted in ignorance and even depend upon ignorance. Our wholesome thoughts don't necessarily depend upon ignorance, but they are still conditioned in that way. So all the good rebirths we have would be the fruits of our virtuous actions. And of course, all the things we experience that are bringing us some measure of happiness, pleasure, what have you. Then, on the other hand, all of the things that we call suffering, that are pain, misery, all of these things, what we went through in our discussion of suffering, all of those are arising from our non virtuous actions. They are the fruit of that. So, this is the mechanism by which we are experiencing samsara. And we have to see that these are all things created within ourselves. We have a tendency to blame others for our suffering, but this is our own creation through the force of our ignorance, giving rise to an action, giving rise to an unwholesome thought, giving rise to an action, and then giving rise to the result. This is how everything arises within samsara. So essentially, we call it karma and delusions because karma are the actions, number 3. But delusions include both the root of ignorance and any of the other accompanying states of mind. We could even include in that, again, virtuous states of mind, because virtuous states of mind, as long as they're rooted in ignorance, are only going to produce results within samsara that are good to have. Sure, it's good to have this human rebirth that is a product of our own virtue that's created in this contaminated existence, but it's not a final result. It's not something we can rely upon. We want that more certain. We talked about this phrase earlier, the certain or definite goodness that comes when we achieve liberation. So we have to understand, first of all, again, the nature of existence as dukkha, as unsatisfactory, and then we have to get why we're in that experience. So we're really clear about what we have to turn away from, what it is that we actually have to do. So that leads us into the path to liberation, which is the very next section. The path to liberation, of course, is the true path that will help us to cease, to cause a true cessation of our dukkha and all the causes of dukkha. This is what we're going to be looking at. There's like one verse for the first 3 or 4 things here that I've put into this outline, and then 2 verses to kind of conclude this section. We often talk about the 3 higher trainings. These are the actual means to attain liberation for oneself, though they are also incorporated in the Bodhisattva path, but they're part of the 6 perfections. In this context, they are the higher training in wisdom, which is based on the higher training in concentration, which is in turn based on the higher training in morality. So we'll look at the verses pertaining to that. Then we're going to talk about them as a unit, the 3 of them together, and then talk about countering the 4 doors, which are the kind of downfalls that we have that cause us to not engage in proper behavior to have the foundation for the whole thing. And you'll be more clarity about that when we get to that later tonight. Let's go back to our text then and enter into these verses that pertain to the path to liberation. Remember that this section was about the functioning of samsara and the path to liberation. So that starts with verse 299. Therefore, if this self-grasping is not expelled, if the root of samsara is not gotten rid of, I cannot be free from samsara. It has to be expelled by what? The wisdom that realizes selflessness, emptiness. That's it. That's the antidote to it. Yeah, other things contribute, merit and so on, but that is the main cause for removing that ignorance. Wisdom, the light of Dharma wisdom, completely dispels the darkness of ignorance. Therefore, I must develop the training relating to wisdom. That's often said to be the third of the 3 higher trainings, but here it's being highlighted as that's the main thing we want to develop. Well, where does that wisdom come from, or how do we get that wisdom at a level that will actually do the job? As it says in verse 300, if my mind is distracted by fading and agitation, it cannot see truly how selfless existence works. So, quelling distractions, I must train in samadhi, meditative stabilization, concentration, dwelling one-pointedly on the deep mode of existence. So again, you absolutely need a foundation of good concentration in order to get the level of wisdom that will actually uproot samsara. If you don't have concentration, then it's going to be very fleeting. You'll have some insight into things, and we've all done some meditation on emptiness, no doubt, where we've gained some understanding of it, albeit quite slight. But nonetheless, if you want to make a lasting final change to your mind, you need concentration. Well, where does concentration come from? You need the support of morality. So let's look at what our text says about that, uh, which here it's the third, but it's the first usually of the three higher trainings. Verse 301, since this samadhi in turn can never develop if I lack watchfulness, mindfulness, and awareness, I must have the training relating to morality, restraining my three doors with firm awareness and mindfulness. So we've talked about morality earlier in terms of karma. And as I said, morality, concentration, and wisdom, all three show up in the six perfections. But we have got to get first our behavior under control, which starts, of course, most basically with our body and speech. We already saw that in the teachings on karma in the small scope. But if we don't start controlling things, then we won't be able to really develop that kind of mindfulness, watchfulness, the introspection that will allow us to do the deeper work of developing concentration. Moreover, I mean, I think if we don't engage in pretty pure morality, it's very hard for the mind to settle. I often point out to people in regard to this that I'm sure you've had that experience where maybe later in the day you sit down to meditate, but you had something that happened earlier in the day that was really upsetting, some conflict with somebody, and maybe you said things that you regret or whatever. Your mind is still turning on the basis of that, you know, inappropriate behavior. It wasn't good for you to do that, and you kind of carry that energy with you even into your meditation. So we want to be able to shut off all of that that kind of distracts the mind, as well as creates an sort of unstillness. The mind is not going to settle very easily if we don't have good morality. So good morality is the foundation. On the basis of that, concentration; on the basis of that, wisdom. They often use the analogy of someone actually chopping down a tree, which is not quite the same as the tree we have here because it's going to be uprooted versus this is just chopping it down. If you have someone wielding an axe that's working on chopping down the tree, the strength of the person is the morality, kind of creates this foundation that is very stable. So that's important to start with. Then, of course, you have to have the correct aim. If you've ever chopped down a tree and you keep hitting the tree in a different place every time, you don't get very far in chopping it down. You need the aim that hits it in the same place every time, that one pointedness, that is concentration. But what is wisdom? Wisdom is the sharpness of the blade of the axe. If you've ever tried to chop wood with a dull axe, I mean, forget it, right? You're not going to get very far at all. But you need all three of these working in tandem. Good strength, strength of body to wield the axe. Then, of course, perfect aim to be able to hit in the same place all the time. And then the sharpness of the blade that will actually allow you to chop the tree down. So let's look at the next verse that pertains to all three of these together. Therefore, since the field where grow the ears of the training in wisdom, bending the tips of the stalks of unwavering concentration, is only morality, it's taught that the pratimoksha is the root of the doctrine. Of course, pratimoksha is referring to the vows of individual liberation. There are a set of lay vows that we can take, 5 vows, but this also, pratimoksha, encompasses the vows of monastics, monks and nuns at their various stages of ordination. And then there's another thing encompassed in there, but let's just leave it at that for now. So what it's using a different analogy here than the axe, the person with the axe. And this one I don't think I've ever seen it in any other text, but essentially you have these grains that need to grow, which are wisdom. We need, it says they're the ears, but like if you have the buds which actually contain what you were looking for, the grain of that that is the real meat of why that plant is there. That's the wisdom. That's the third training. But the stalks are the concentration that have to come up out of the ground of morality, the field of morality. It's kind of another way of looking at it, but again, all three are needed. You need that basis of the ground, the stalk of concentration that comes up, and then the ears that contain the grains that are essentially going to be blossoming from that concentration, from those stalks. So again, just another way to look at this. Um, Now we're going to go into the section on countering the four doors. So let me actually go off this to the slides, because I put the four doors on the slide so you can see them, because we get kind of the antidotes to them, and you can infer what the faults are, these doors by which we have, again, the opportunity, perhaps we might call it, uh, for negative actions to come into play. These are, again, the ways in which we are not going to be able to stay true to our good morality. That's why they're being introduced here, because morality, once more, is the foundation. The first of the four doors of kind of misbehavior, negative actions, is the door of not knowing the advice. So we have to study very well what is entailed in maintaining good morality, engaging in virtuous activities, and avoiding faults. And this is especially in regard to vows. Before we take the pratimoksha or bodhisattva vows, we should study them very extensively so we know how to uphold them. The second one is the door of lack of respect. We may be having misbehavior because we're not respecting the teachers who gave us this advice, the Buddha himself. We're not really engaged in everything that will be supporting our kind of commitment to engaging in virtue and avoiding non-virtue. The third is the door of recklessness. Of course, this means that we aren't having the mindful awareness, the introspection, and so on that is really necessary to curtail our negative behavior. We just simply get reckless, we're careless. The fourth is the door of strong defilements. Of course, we all are dealing with defilements without a doubt, but if we have some that are particularly quite strong, they might be acting as an impetus for us to engage in misbehavior as well. So we need to practice the antidotes to the defilements. Most Lamrim texts have some section at the end where they work with giving this sort of advice. Because even though concentration and wisdom are the second and third ones, we have to really start in this section with the first one, which is morality. And because morality is important to re-emphasize as so essential to our practice. And concentration and wisdom are taught when we get to the great scope and the teachings of the perfections of the Bodhisattva. So let's look at the verses that pertain to these kind of overcoming these four doors. Um, so it says there, verse 303, so as the ground for my pratimoksha training, I must first hear the advices. That's the antidote to not knowing the advice, right? We have to actually hear and study the advice that's given to us in terms of maintaining good morality, especially in regard to our vows. And of course, monks and nuns, if you're fully ordained, you have hundreds of vows. So you need to know them very well so you maintain that morality. Number two, develop respect for the master, meaning the Buddha, but of course we can also entail in that all of the teachers that are our teachers in our lives that are there guiding us, and for the vows, and for the advice given by the Buddha. We should have that level of respect because this is the path that the Buddha taught for us. This is his way out that we need to follow. So we need to have respect for the Buddha in particular, as well as the vows that he's given us. Then, third, as the antidote to our recklessness, our carelessness, rely on alertness, which is here a term that's used for introspection, mindfulness. Of course, that's what we know of as that non-forgetfulness, and then watchfulness or heedfulness. These are the kind of the three main factors that play a role in helping us to not be reckless in our behavior. Having an introspection that is observing what we're doing, a mindfulness that isn't forgetting the main principles we are trying to follow day in and day out in our behavior, and the heedfulness that is being very careful rather than careless, making sure that we're aware of as much as we can so that we don't go astray and have that kind of conscientiousness in all of our behavior. Then we get to the fourth one, again, the fault, the door that we have for negative actions to be committed is the door of strong defilements. So here you must know the defilement's specific opponents. All right. So what are the opponents? I don't want to do a whole teaching on that because I know I've even taught some of this to many of you before when we went through the course on the joy of letting go. And I went into, all the various levels of trying to work with the afflictions. Every delusion has what we might call a more specific antidote, which is one that kind of meets it head on and is counter to it. Whereas the ultimate antidote, the antidote to all of them, of course, is the wisdom realizing emptiness that overcomes the ignorance that is the support for all of those. It's the ground upon which all of that arises, the roots of those. So, what are the specific antidotes? And just go through them very briefly for just a few of these. For attachment, of course, the main antidote is to see the faults of the things we are attached to. Attachment is overlaying like these amazing qualities on things that are just our imagination. We have to kind of bring the mind back down and realize that things are not perfect and beautiful and wonderful. I mean, we have to see the faults, the flaws in them. So we bring our mind back down so the attachment doesn't have ground to arise. We can also use the awareness of impermanence to help overcome attachment because most of the things we're attached to, right, are things that we're going to lose. They don't have any lasting ability to be in our lives. We'll have to lose them at death without a doubt, but even in life, we lose many things, people, possessions, what have you. So wherever we have attachment, we try to apply an antidote along those lines. Again, seeing the faults or seeing the impermanence of these objects, and of course, of the experience of these objects. For anger, if it's anger directed at a person, they say the main antidote is to try to cultivate love for that person. We're talking about the love that sees them through that lens of a being who simply wants to be happy, and we want them to be happy. And in fact, if those people who we're angry at were happy, they probably wouldn't be annoying us. They wouldn't be doing things that are difficult for us. So as much as possible, we want to always have a mind of loving kindness towards others that keeps the anger, the hatred from developing towards them. But of course, just the whole practice of developing patience, which I've also taught on for many of you. I think I did a course called Finding Calm in the Storm, where we went into all the techniques for overcoming anger and developing patience. Patience is a mind that remains undisturbed in the face of whatever it is that would normally trigger that kind of energy, that anger, aversion, what have you. So, yeah, I won't go into great detail on that, but we have these more specific antidotes. But we'll stop there with those two of anger and attachment. But we can see how they're specific. When you have a mind of attachment towards something and you're seeing it as pleasant, you don't want to kind of think about love for that being or other thoughts that are along those lines because they're not an antidote to that. We need something that brings the mind down from that excitement that we're having around that object to see things more clearly. Whereas when we have anger, you don't want to see the unpleasant characteristics of that person or object or experience because you're already seeing that. You're already kind of reacting to that. You want to see something favorable there. You want to be able to look at beings through the lens of loving kindness rather than hatred or anger. So again, they're quite specific. Whereas again, the ultimate antidote of the wisdom realizing emptiness overcomes all of these delusions equally because they are all rooted in this fundamental misunderstanding. What was identified in our text a few stanzas ago as self-grasping. So let's go to the final verse. I think it's the final verse of this section, where we look at kind of this final bit of advice on working to counteract the four doors. It says, duly restrain the four doors of production of downfalls. Again, that we just looked at the advice on how to do that. And carrying out without transgressions the orders of the compassionate, matchless Supreme Master, the Buddha, as I have vowed, establish the root of the doctrine. Kind of these are the means for establishing morality, the root of the doctrine, the three principal or three, I'm sorry, higher trainings. Three higher trainings are rooted in the first one of practicing good morality. So we have to do this. We have to actually, again, engage in counteracting these four doors day in and day out so that we stop creating immorality, stop actually creating the causes to be in samsara. Okay, so that's all that's said in terms of this second level of the stages of the path. Obviously, there's a whole lot more that is practice as part of this. And as I said, they did normally in any long room text, they don't go especially into concentration and wisdom, the two of the three higher trainings. They don't go into them much here because we're going to see them as the fifth and the sixth perfection of a bodhisattva. So maybe before I go on, let me stop here, take a breath, and also just kind of check in to see if there are any questions on this whole set of teachings in particular, of looking at this middle scope, where once more the motivation is one's own liberation. And we're not trying to be really selfish there in terms of our bodhisattva path. We still have to start looking at our own situation quite clearly before we can kind of know exactly the situation of others. There's a wonderful verse from Master Shantideva where he says, how can beings who have never seen things for themselves possibly wish that for another? I mean, if I haven't wished for my own liberation, how can I possibly enter the Mahayana path, the great scope, and actually want others to be liberated? I have to want this for myself first. So, questions, comments on this second level of the stages of the path? Anything? Okay. So again, I would encourage you. We've got 2 weeks actually till our next class. I'm still going to keep teaching. Don't, I'm not ending the class here. I'm going to go into the beginning of the Great Scope. But I would encourage you, since we do have 2 weeks, maybe the first week you can review this middle scope and really try to work on meditating on these various sufferings, especially the three types of suffering we went into, kind of meditating on the way in which we are reborn through this process of our delusions giving rise, or ignorance giving rise to delusions, delusions giving rise to actions, actions giving rise to our actual experience of suffering, and so on, to develop a sense of renunciation, to really try to see things for what they are. Remember, there was a wonderful quote from Venerable Tenzin Palmo, really quite amazing practitioner, where she said, we have to see samsara as essentially being a prison and not get preoccupied with like people who say, oh, well, if I paint my prison cell a different shade of green, well, maybe it's not such a bad place to be then. It's a prison cell. We are in prison and we have been in prison since beginningless time. We have to get to that point where we just say, okay, enough is enough. I'm not going to do this anymore. Then we get the strength to enter into the Mahayana with a clear understanding of what it is that is the goal for all beings. So it's not just about my own liberation, it's about every being, being free from their suffering, all the causes of that, attaining, well-being and happiness, and going on, of course, to achieve their ultimate potential of Buddhahood. So let's take a look at some slides that get us into this next section. Oh, I did have some quotes. Sorry, I keep forgetting these wonderful quotes from Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe that I've inserted here. So to conclude that section, the middle capable being is someone with the attitude and aim to completely leave samsara behind. They don't have the slightest attraction to any aspect of samsara for even a second, seeing it as completely in the nature of suffering, as a nest of poisonous snakes or a pit of red hot coals. Again, I was using the analogy of a prison. Maybe these are even more vivid. If we see samsara in that light of being like a pit of snakes or, red hot coals, whatever. Okay, their aim is to achieve liberation through practicing the three higher trainings of morality, concentration, and wisdom. This is the path of the middle capable being who practices the three higher trainings on the basis of the path of the lower capable being, living in the 10 virtues, which is the essence of that entire set of teachings that we went through when we talked about the stages of the small scope, the lower capable being. Okay, so now the apex of our practice in terms of the sutra studies and even including the tantric studies is the path of the superior person. We have quite a large section for this that we'll cover again starting tonight and for the 4 remaining classes that we have. This is divided into 2 parts as well. First is the development of bodhicitta, which is the way of entering into the great scope. We get first a reason why we have to enter this path. That's 2 verses. Why is it essential that we actually cultivate bodhicitta and what have you? And then the techniques for developing bodhicitta, here referred to as the 7 instructions of cause and effect, and then the exchange of self and others, which is more frequently called equalizing and exchanging self and others. I think I shortened it because that was what was in the outline in the book. So that's what we're going to go into first, is how we develop bodhicitta, why we have to do that. Then we'll look at the second section, how to train in the bodhisattva's conduct, and that includes entering into the path of Tantra. Whoops, let me stop here then and go to the text and do the first couple verses, and then we'll come back to take a look. Oop, got very fuzzy there again. I don't know why my camera does that, but sorry. Let's do the verses. So we see that on this page, the actual practice, the path of the superior person, we have meditation number 9, the development of bodhicitta. So we have the first topic, how to think about the reason one must enter this path. If I train well in the 3 trainings as described, and in morality, concentration, and wisdom, again, taking them in their more proper order, I shall indeed free myself from the samsaric ocean. Without a doubt, that's the technique for those inclined to doing that, to actually be free from samsara and attain the state of nirvana. But striving to free just myself from samsara, not thinking about the sentient beings tormented there, is like leaving one's aged mother shut up in prison and getting oneself somehow set free. Is there anyone less considerate than that? Therefore, I must liberate all migrators. This is an analogy that's often used. Of course, we're going to talk about this concept of seeing all beings as one's mother. And that is a very effective way of kind of developing a sense of affection for them. But if we were in a burning house and there were other beings that we had a close connection with in the house as well, it would be really selfish and cruel, right? To go exiting the house to get ourselves out of the burning house and not think about the others that are left behind. And especially when we consider, as we will get into in these teachings, as you know, we're going to look at the kindness of others, the interdependence that we have with others, the fact that they have contributed to our welfare in so many ways. It'd be a real slap in the face if we just said, hope you guys get out of that fire, but I'm exiting because I found the way out. Take care. Hope it works out for you. Pretty cruel, right? That's the logic behind this Mahayana path, is that we see that we're not alone in our predicament. Every being's situation is fundamentally the same as our own. So we are talking about in the motivation tonight, right? Where we see our own situation clearly, that we don't stop there. We can use that as a template for every being we examine, whether it's an ant crawling on our desk or whether it's, the president of the United States or whoever. We have to see them all through the lens of being sentient beings who are under the control of their karma and delusions and experiencing the varieties of dukkha, of dissatisfaction. And every one of them having the potential to be free from all of that and to attain the deeper result of attaining Buddhahood, accomplishing their ultimate welfare. So this is the logic behind it, that we look at it and we go, well, I have to be concerned about others because there is no, as we're going to see in the wisdom teachings, there's no independent self. We saw that even earlier in this idea of separating self and other. That this is one of the main root causes of kind of our continuing to be in samsara, is because we keep grasping at this sense of me, and needing to take care of ourselves as something isolated from others, when that isolation is actually an illusion. There is no self and others inherently. We can identify it conventionally as myself and others, but we are all of the same basic nature, and we need to have that more universal concern, especially regarding the interdependence of beings and myself. So let's go on then to the first of these techniques. Um, I didn't know, I mean, I can pass this along to Colleen to provide to all of you. I think I provided it when I taught you last year, though, and the text that we did on mind training and um, that course, I can't remember the name of. That was uh, the arrows course, turning arrows into flowers. I put a little handout together again that I'll redistribute to Colleen to give to you, but I think you have this. This is the way that they're generally presented as we start with the preliminary step of developing equanimity, which we will see here in the context of the first one, the 7-point cause and effect instruction. And there's 7 steps that are meant to be kind of one leading to the next. And we'll go through these as we go through it. I don't want to go through them right now, but at least on this handout, you have them all listed. Then we have the second technique, the instruction on equalizing and exchanging self with others. It's a very different technique in some ways, though it has similarities in terms of still being quite rooted in love and compassion, which are the essential nature of bodhicitta, if you will, is this compassionate wish to benefit others. That's the second technique, but on this handout, I also put together the 11-step combined method that Pabanka Rinpoche presents in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. That's a way of taking the essence of each of these and working with them together. So my hope is that maybe I can at least get into some of the beginning of this first one and you can start working with it. But I know that it'd be hard to kind of do all of that. So let's go to the first step. And these are kind of repeated in the um, slides. So I'll go back to the slides in a moment. But essentially what we have in the beginning of this is how to achieve even-mindedness, or what we often call equanimity, an equal regard for all beings. So verse 307 is kind of the setup for that. It says, also, although now all these migrating beings appear as friends, foes, or as neutral beings, and being attached to this, I develop attachment for the friends, hatred for foes, and for neutral folk, unconcern or indifference. So this is one of the kind of stumbling stones that we have in regard to generating bodhicitta that embraces all beings, is because beings naturally fall into one of these 3 categories for us. They are friends, close ones, acquaintances, people that we enjoy. They are difficult people, foes, enemies, however you want to label them, that do things that we don't appreciate and that annoy us or even cause us pain or cause pain to those that we love or hold political views that are opposed to ours, whatever the case might be. And then we have the neutrals, the strangers, this vast quantity of beings that we don't have a defined relationship with. Pema Chodron often describes these as beings who haven't yet come into our lives to be identified as a friend or a foe. We don't know them. You see them on the street, you see them on planes when you're traveling or whatever. You don't really have much feeling for them. Maybe they might do something that causes them, they might bump into you and then suddenly they become, oh, you're now in that category. You're now a foe. Or you sit next to them on the plane, they start talking to you, and you get to kind of like who they are. And you go, oh, now I've got a friend, someone who I think, good things about. Well, having these categories isn't the problem. We do this all the time in every single lifetime. The attachment to friends, the attitude of attachment we have towards them, the attitude of aversion or anger, hatred that we have towards enemies, the attitude of indifference we have towards strangers, that's the culprit, because that blocks us from having that equal regard. So in this meditation, you're often encouraged to look at the fact that there's nothing set about these roles. The beings who are your dearest friends have been your worst enemies in another life, maybe even in this life. That does happen sometimes, right? In like grade school, they're your arch enemy, and you don't want to even be out on the playground with them or whatever. And then maybe things change in high school, and suddenly you see a different side of them, and you become best buddies with them or something. That happens in a lifetime. It happens inevitably in terms of many lifetimes. We have been in these changing roles with every being countless times. So there's nothing fixed about this. We are making a determination in terms of our attitude of attachment for friends, hatred towards enemies, and indifference towards strangers on the basis of this moment in time. That's it. There's no solid basis because it's changed even within this life and of course over many lifetimes. That's the logic that we look at in terms of developing this even-mindedness, this preliminary step for generating bodhicitta. So let's look at the first two verses on that. First, about enemies. Still, those who seem to be enemies at present have in the past been my mother's many times. They've helped me in such ways as feeding me with their milk and lovingly nursing and guarding me from all harm. All those who seem to be friends at present, so let's talk about those friends. They too have in the past been the clearest of enemies. Numerous times they have killed or beaten me, and even devoured me alive. This also is taught, right? They've played that role. Also, you move it up a little bit, those who seem to be neutral at present, in many former lifetimes, have variously been friends and foes. They've done me harm in anger, and also infinite times done me good with love. Therefore, among all these migrating beings, which should I hate, and which should I be attached to? Let me now not discriminate liked and hated, but have equal mind towards all of them as my friends. This is the idea that we don't just want to have a kind of indifference towards all of them. We actually want to try to see them all eventually in a very positive light. That's kind of going to get us into the very first step of the sevenfold cause and effect method, which is to see all beings as having been your mother. So then, verse 312, if I should think, since friend and foe aren't certain, due to this contemplation, it's not right either to inflict harm or to give aid, but it is right to abide unconcerned, then this is not correct. This is what I was just saying. Okay, I shouldn't, harm them. I shouldn't kind of be solely focused on giving them aid and being attached to them. Rather, I should be unconcerned. I should be indifferent. Well, that's not correct. Since the terrible harm by past lives' foes was diluted, not knowing I was their parents, then anger is wrong. And since the help they provided in past lives when they were friends resided in truth, why should I not repay this help? Essentially, what he's doing in those last few verses, as I take it, is that he's saying, don't make the mistake of falling into kind of a complacency about all beings. Yes, you're going to develop some equal regard for them, but don't let that regard be indifference. We want to actually see all beings in terms of their fundamental condition, that they are under the control of their delusions, and that's why they might do things that appear to be harming us and so on. And so we understand their situation. This is a way of also equalizing other beings, is when we see that they're all in the same fundamental situation. We're going to see that as part of the equalizing and exchanging self in others, that we get that there really is no fundamental difference between every one of us in terms of our basic needs, wanting to be happy, wanting to not suffer. And of course, not really having figured out how to do that yet after countless lifetimes. That's what the Buddhist path is all about, is to help us to actually find the happiness we seek. But most beings are suffering because they don't understand that at all, and they're going about it in a completely wrong way. So this isn't to get us to this kind of numbed out state with all beings and just feel blah about all of them. We want to, again, get rid of these three different attitudes and embrace all of them within the scope of our love and compassion as we get to that stage of developing those within the techniques for generating bodhicitta. Okay, so let me go back to the slides while I'm off the text. So we went through again how to achieve even-mindedness now. We're going to go on then in terms of talking about how to meditate on recognizing beings as one's mother. That's the first step. And it isn't like thinking, oh, maybe they were my mother. It's really getting to the absolute conviction that every being has been your kind mother, has been your mother, not just once, but many times, because we've had countless rebirths. Then how to meditate on remembering their kindness, because we want to develop that sense of they have been very kind to us. Therefore, thirdly, I have to know, I should say repaying, it's repaying their kindness. We have to meditate on kind of wanting to develop some reciprocation for what they have done for us, and not just in a temporal way, but in a much more ultimate way. Those three are usually put together because they are the setup for the remaining steps of this. Let's talk about those three, and maybe we'll get through those tonight in terms of the meditation. But this technique is very much geared at that idea of wanting to feel a sense of affection for other beings. Right now, we certainly have affection for the friends, the close ones that are in that circle. We have maybe some slight affection for some beings who are strangers, maybe that we see something on the TV about somebody who's suffering. We don't know them, but just that might cause some concern to arise for them. But towards the difficult people, the last thing we have probably is concern. That is not something we naturally experience, right? So we have to see all beings through the lens of someone who's been very dear to us. And the mother is used because it's such a powerful archetype in our culture and is really, in a human existence, so essential to our well being. Every one of us had mothers who at least cared for us in some way at our beginning stages of life, or we wouldn't be here right now. Maybe your mothers didn't live up to what we would ideally have liked as a parent, but nonetheless, they took care of you. Even Venerable Rabina, I think may have shared this with some of you before, but she was asked once by somebody who said, my mother just gave birth to me and then gave me away. She had nothing else to do with me, didn't nurse me for a second, didn't, care for me, kiss me, hug me, whatever. And Venerable Rabina said, well, at least she didn't abort you, dear. so so there's a kindness right there by just the mothers having carried us in their womb for 9 months or however long we were in the womb. Some might have been born premature or what have you, but nonetheless, that's a great kindness. You wouldn't be here right now with this body if your mother had aborted you, right? So let's start this process of this first step of seeing all beings as having been your mother. This is this next set of meditations. Now, if we ask, how is it that in fact every sentient being has been my mother? It's because there's no commencement to my births, and I've taken bodies infinite in number. This is based on the idea of the continuity of consciousness, right? That consciousness is always arising from a previous moment of consciousness. There's no start to consciousness. It is always arising from something previous to it. Therefore, there's no beginning to our consciousness. One may think, verse 315, if there are infinite sentient beings, it is not reasonable all could have been my mother. But it is reasonable, since just as sentient beings are numberless, so do my rebirths have no finite number. Right? So we may think, oh, the infinite numbers of sentient beings means they can't possibly all have been my mother. But that's exactly why they have, because you've had infinite rebirths, and every rebirth you had where you were born from an egg or in the womb, you have required a mother to play that role. So we're kind of going through the whole logic behind this. We're going to see that it's also spelled out in scripture. But the logic is important to get because they say this is one of the hardest realizations to get, that all beings have been your mother without a doubt. The reason for this is there's no point to be shown I'm sorry, let me read this again. The reason for this is there's no first point to be shown such that only since then has this mind existed, right? There's not a beginning point. Most of the other spiritual traditions always want to posit an initial point, the time the world was created. And when His Holiness even discussed with scientists about their theories about how this universe came into existence, he'll say, oh, no problem with the Big Bang. There's just something before that. There's a Big Bang that occurred, prior to that as well. There's no initial point where everything comes into existence. Same for our consciousness. Thus, no limit is seen to the bodies I've taken either. But then, apart from the times I've taken birth from heat and moisture, or miraculously, which are said to be the two other ways that we can take birth, whatever body I've taken born from womb or egg must necessarily have had parents. So it's logically proven all could have been my parents. So we kind of get this logic if we think about it. You've had countless births because there's no beginning to your births. And you've required a mother every time you've been born from the womb or from an egg. Well, then somebody played that role. I think it's totally unreasonable that it was just a handful of beings, because that would make no sense at all, right? That you're in this little kind of tunnel, this vortex of just certain beings that are playing an intimate role for you and no one else playing that role. We have connections with all beings, some of them closer in time, some of them much further away. Every being has been in that role for you. And of course, the being born in a womb as a human being, we do see very clearly the role that the mother plays. In some species of animals and so on in the world, we maybe see animals that are not as concerned about their offspring as what humans are generally in terms of caring for their young. But there still is a kindness there. Even I talk about like sea turtles. Sea turtles, right? They come up on the beach and they find a nice spot where the eggs can be buried in the sand, where they'll get enough heat and protection to be able to eventually hatch. Yeah, the mothers are long gone when those little baby turtles come out and start flopping their way to the ocean. But nonetheless, that's an incredible kindness too, just to have taken that opportunity to create an ideal situation for those turtles to hatch and for them to be able to kind of have their lives as best as they can. So mothers are involved in our welfare in those existences without a doubt. The two that are mentioned, heat and moisture, I just might point out that I'm not sure where that came from. If it was maybe uh, they tend to say that when we look at the way that really small creatures arise, like mosquitoes that will come out of the small eggs that are laid on the pond surface or whatever water surface. Well, to the naked eye, they're probably not seen, right? So there might have been this impression that beings are rising from moisture. Well, they still have eggs, and there are eggs that are involved in mosquitoes or other small creatures being born. It's real unclear as to where that one kind of comes from in terms of where heat and moisture come into play as something that can be shown scientifically. But nonetheless, miraculously, this is the idea of like in a hell existence, you are born there immediately. There's no kind of gestation period. You're not like a little hell baby and a hell mother, who gives birth to you. You actually are born with your limbs fully complete and ready to experience all the varieties of suffering in that hell realm. So this is again those two rebirths of womb and egg we have without a doubt required mothers to be involved in our welfare. So let's see, where was I? Oh, maybe didn't read that one. Okay, this is the kind of proof from Scripture. This last part, verse 318 says, "The omniscient one, meaning the Buddha, who never taught falsehood, also taught that these three things, that are coming up, uh, they, are not what he perceived. So they are first, all beings who wander in samsara have not been born in this place in former times, or they have not taken bodies just like this, or we've never been each other's parents, brothers and sisters, friends and relatives. Those three things were not what the Buddha perceived. He saw the opposite. That absolutely, we were born in these places in former times. We have taken bodies just like these, and we have been each other's parents, brothers, and sisters, and so on. Yeah, countless times. So, since it's established by scripture, all these migrating beings have been my mother as well. We can look at it from that point of view. Again, if we have strong conviction in the Buddha as a reliable guide, well, maybe that's enough to convince us. But I think the reasoning that was pointed out, the logic that we examine, is really the heart of the meditation. Not to just, oh, I believe the Buddha, I believe the Buddha, but to say, I can see the logic of it. Okay. Verse 320, for this reason, just as I shall not recognize even my parents of this life after death, when I go on to my next life, my dear mother and father, I won't recognize them. They'll be in a different form. Their consciousness will have appropriated another set of aggregates, and I won't have any recollection of the role that they played in my life in this existence that I have now. Since we're reborn and die, I simply don't recognize beings. But in fact, they are all my mothers who have cherished me kindly. This is a powerful meditation, to see all beings in that light. And of course, the next step after this is to reflect on the kindness that they showed us when they were our mothers. And they use the example of our own mothers of this life. Again, if you don't have that relationship with your mother of this life, and maybe your mother was not as intimately involved in your welfare, well, then you can think about it in a more archetypal way, archetypal, I'm not sure what the right word is. Or you can even look upon, other examples that you know from your life, other beings, animals, humans, whatever, that you can see examples of the way that mothers care for their young and so on. Or you can even think in more general terms about the kindness that we experience from beings day in and day out, that we require their involvement in our welfare. So I'm not going to go on to that section right now because I think, even though it's not too many verses, but nonetheless, it's getting down to the last few minutes of tonight. Um, but this is something you're certainly welcome to work with. Actually, it's quite a few verses now that I look at it, to see the kindness that our mother showed us in the womb before we were born, at birth, when we actually they gave birth to us. And I take my camera off again. I'm getting fuzzy again. And then, of course, when we were an infant, as we grew up and so on in childhood. And then we kind of translate that as to what others must have done then as well. So any questions or comments from tonight? Yes, please, Ruth.
This probably goes without saying, but since all sentient beings have been our mother, then we've been all sentient beings' mothers.
This is
And
true.
yeah, yeah. And at least because I've been a parent, I can really relate to that feeling of, loving, caring,
Mm,
taking care of somebody without any thought to myself.
mhm. Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, not when they're teenagers, of course, but you know, but when they're, when they're babies, I mean, it's just all
Yeah,
about, it's all about them. So,
yeah, yeah,
anyway, just thought
yeah.
I'd
No,
throw that.
and this is absolutely true. I mean, we're one of those beings that others are looking upon as having been their mother, and that every being can say that. Every one of us has been everyone else's mother. It's perfectly valid. I guess the danger sometimes is we might look at that and think, well, then we're all even, right? I've been your mother countless times, you've been my mother countless times. Well, who's counting? Do we really have to uh, repay the kindness of those beings?
So,
When we get to that section, we'll see that, yeah, there's an explanation behind that, of like acknowledging that we're looking at repaying kindness in much more profound ways than simply being other sentient beings' mother. That's great that we can all play that role, and many of you have played that role in this life, been the mother to one or more beings that are in this world, and you've helped them to have some measure of happiness by virtue of your actions. We want to try to repay the kindness of others, having been our mothers, in deeper ways, and actually helping them to attain the happiness that they seek. But I'm glad you pointed that out, because it is a nice way to think about the kindness of mothers, by having experienced what it's like to be a mother yourself, or a father. Or many of us, of course, have also been sisters, brothers, to others who have been reliant upon us to some degree. So these are, yeah, worthwhile to bring to mind when you're going through that meditation, this next period, bit that we'll go into next week.
yeah.
The kindness. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I realized what my parents went through until I had a kid.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, you did this 4 times. Holy smokes.
Yeah. Might
Yeah.
not really appreciate, yeah, everything they did until you have to do it yourself.
No, no, no. And also being a parent, I think, is a nice segue into your just how to uh, get to that compassion piece,
Mm, mm,
but and being selfless.
mhm. And again, not to make people
Patient.
who haven't been parents feel
No,
bad or anything, because there's the same level of care often with pets too, as well, right? Because our pets are so totally dependent upon us. If they were left on their own out in the wild, they might not even survive more than a couple of nights to get the food that they need, or the protection from the elements and what have you. So we all have played certainly some role of protector, carer for various beings in various times in our lives. So yeah, we all have means of still learning about compassion, enacting compassion in our lives. But I do agree that the role of a parent in particular who's raising children is, it's very profound, very selfless act that does require a lot to do, certainly. So, any other questions or comments? And so we do have 2 weeks. Next Tuesday, I'm having my little hernia surgery, which should be pretty painless and not so difficult, I'm hoping. But anyway, I appreciate any prayers nonetheless. But if you don't, if you forget to pray, don't worry. I mean, hopefully it's all covered. Hopefully I've got the good karma to make it through that. But we won't have class then next Tuesday, and we will have class the following Tuesday, July 2nd, I believe it is. Maybe 2nd, yeah. And then we skip again because on the 9th, there are some folks who will be away. And so we're just, rather than having a very small class, we're going to have a kind of forego that class. And we've had to push everything out a week because of missing last week. So we're going to do the next 3 Tuesdays in July. So we've got 4 more classes, July 2nd, and then the last 3 Tuesdays in July. And hopefully we'll conclude everything with this text then. And but I'm hoping, again, you can find the time to meditate specifically on the first part of what we covered tonight and working with renunciation, seeing the suffering of existence, and so on in the first week in your meditation. And then the following week, maybe start to work a bit with this technique of the sevenfold cause and effect, at least with equanimity and seeing beings as your mother, though. Again, you can go beyond that. You don't have to stop there if you want to meditate at least on the first 3 ones of seeing their kindness then and also wishing to repay their kindness. There's nothing that profound about these verses. They're very self-explanatory. When we come back next time on 2 weeks, I won't be saying that much about the verses that are in those sections. So good enough. All right, let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers. So seeing that we have to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. And we've been doing all of our study tonight together with the mind of bodhicitta. We dedicate for that result, our attainment of Buddhahood, so we can then skillfully guide all beings to attaining that supreme state. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And we make prayers first for His Holiness. And when we are saying this, include in your mind all the beings who are playing the role of Guru for others that we need to keep in this world, that we want to have their wishes fulfilled, and so on. It's important for us to create the causes from our side for that to happen. So let's recite the prayer for His Holiness with those thoughts. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then the prayer for Rinpoche to return. Once more, we need to create the causes for that. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that being, that essence, that mind, has no intention of abandoning us, but we have to create the causes for his incarnation to appear. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Partyeka Buddhas, victorious Losam, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And lastly, we dedicate for whoever we're holding in our hearts, those who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died. And we dedicate for their welfare, giving this merit to them so that they can experience the benefits of that, have their suffering removed immediately, and all the causes for their temporal and ultimate happiness to be achieved immediately as well. And may this happen for all sentient beings through what we've done here tonight. Again, thank you all for your support over the last few weeks, and really appreciate, again, knowing that you all are there and have concern for me, my mother, and my family. So appreciate your continued prayers, and I will see you all in 2 weeks, barring any unfortunate ripening of karma. Let's hope that doesn't happen. I have no doubt that it will all be fine, but you never know. So, all right. Blessings to you all. Be well.
Thanks, Dad.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so much.
Colleen, Bill. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Okay. All right. Bye bye.